I know exactly how I got the idea for this book, and the development of from the idea to the finished novel was very logical, or at least that's what I thought when I started out. Now I'm not that sure. There are a lot of theories about creativity. When I think of my own, I'm reminded of a philosophy course I took way back in college. In this introduction to philosophy course, I learned about Greek philosopher Lucretius and his theory about how the world came to be. And if I'm remembering correctly, Lucretius believed that there were little teeny tiny little things which he called atoms, that had hooks on them. And they floated in the void like little dust motes. And every now and then, after 1,000 years or so, one would bump up against the other and they would hook on. And as the eons passed, they began eventually to take shape and begin to form things. I believe that somewhere in my head there's a very dusty closet. And there are little teeny tiny things floating around in it. And every now and then they hook onto each other and they begin to take some kind of shape. And I think a lot of books start out, or a lot of stories start out that way, and it's really hard to say just what got the whole thing going, where the process really began. However, with this particular book, I know exactly how it began. I was in my kitchen chopping up carrots for a salad. I just realized that's very phallic, isn't it? That's really what I was doing. I was chopping. And I was listening to the radio, and there was an interview on the radio with a woman who was a dyslexic non-reader. And she was talking about how difficult her life had been because of her problem. And it was a very interesting discussion. And she described, for instance, dating, trying to go out with guys and not wanting to tell them that she couldn't read, and being taken to restaurants and not having any idea what was on the menu and having to order a salad. And as I was listening to this, I thought, I wonder if that's an idea for a super romance. And so the next time I talked to my editor, and she said, "Louise, have you had an idea lately?" I said, "Why, yes. How does this strike you?" And I told her about the adult woman, dyslexic non-reader. And she said, "Well, that's really interesting, but we do have a book coming out this month about a hero who can't read," which just goes to prove something that I've experienced again and again. You think you've had this incredibly original thought, and you discover that 6 months ago, half the world had this thought. But she said, "I'll get back to you." So she called, I think she called a couple days later, and she said, "I've talked about your idea to the people in the office, and they're interested. We haven't done dyslexia." So I said, "Okay." So that was how this particular book got started. So I'm looking at, all I have at this point is a heroine who's dyslexic and can't read. And from that, I wanted to develop a proposal for a novel. Well, I've written enough romances, I think, at this point to have an idea what the basic ingredients for a romance are. And I've written them down on the blackboard, and they are conflict, a hero and heroine, a subplot, minor characters, and then you have to make a decision about the tone of the book and the point of view. I didn't have to decide about tone because she said she thought a real tearjerker would be nice. So that was decided for me, which was fine. The most important of these ingredients is the conflict, because you can't tell a story unless you have one. And that's any kind of story. In romance, the conflict has to be between the hero and the heroine. It has to be a fairly simple and clear-cut conflict, I think. It has to be a good enough conflict so that it will take you all the way through the story, not be resolved in the middle and leave you treading water for the second half of the book. And it has to be a conflict that makes sense. And I think most vitally important, it has to be a conflict that doesn't make either the hero or the heroine look like a jerk. So it can't be a misunderstanding or something that seems unreasonable on either one of their parts. Well, the conflict in this case seemed to me that it would come out of the fact that my heroine couldn't read. And I think, as in most conflicts, what I realized at this point was that this conflict would have to come from character. In other words, if you have a woman who can't read and who isn't the least bit upset about it and tells everyone, is very open about it, and if you have a hero who doesn't mind that his girlfriend can't read, it's no problem for him, you don't have a story. Well, you have a story, but you don't have the kind of story I was going to have to write, or not have to, wanted to write. So I knew that I had to develop characters, main characters, which would make this conflict plausible. So I started out with my heroine. What have I learned about heroines? Well, the main thing I've learned is that they have to be very appealing. They have to be very warm. The romance reader wants to identify with the heroine of the story, wants to like her, wants to feel that she can sort of put herself in that woman's place. I don't think this is so important with mainstream books. I read a lot of mainstream where there was no way I could identify with that woman, yet I found her interesting and intriguing enough that I was interested in reading the story. But this is not the case in romance, at least not with me. I want to be able to put myself in her place. Well, so right away I had a problem. How can a romance reader who can obviously read really identify with a woman who can't? And perhaps even more importantly, how could I identify with a woman who can't? Because one of the few things I can do is read. And it was very hard for me at that point, anyway, to imagine what it would be like not to. So the next thing I did was go to the library and take out a lot of books on dyslexia. And this is one of I think, the wonderful things about being a writer. It's a very educational thing to be. You're always learning new stuff. And I read all these books, and it was very, very fascinating for me. I learned a lot about dyslexia. And I can't tell you all the things I learned, but I learned, for one thing, that dyslexic people are often very, very bright, that some of the most brilliant minds in Western culture have been dyslexic. There's evidence that Da Vinci was a dyslexic. William Butler Yeats was dyslexic. And there's a whole honor roll of people that we all would recognize the name who were dyslexic. I learned that dyslexia can run in families, can be inherited. And this was an important thing for me to learn when I was developing conflict. Because later on in the book, one of my heroine's reasons for not wanting to make a commitment to the hero is knowing that their children could inherit her disability. I learned that dyslexic people or non-readers develop very strong memories. They have to as a form of self-defense in order to survive in a society where reading is such an important thing. I learned that dyslexic people tend to be artistic. I learned that they often have very brutal experiences in school where dyslexia is misunderstood and taken for stupidity, and that this can be a very scarring experience, a very alienating experience for them. So putting all these things together, I began to get a much stronger feeling for what kind of person my heroine had to be. I thought originally that I would like to make her an artist, but Harlequin has done market research, which leads them to believe that romance readers don't want to read about artists. So I knew artist was out. So I decided a craftsperson or an artisan of some kind. And this is where the dust closet comes in. I was casting about for what kind of a craftsperson she could be. It happened that I had recently had slipcovers and drapes made for my house. And when the guy came in to cut the slipcovers and fit them to the chairs, I was really very impressed at how skilled he was and how cleverly he did this. And I asked him, how did you learn to do this? And he said that he was Italian. He said, it's a family business and I just grew up knowing how. Anyway, this popped into this bit of hooked Adam or whatever bumped into what I was thinking about the heroine, and I thought, well, I'll make her a person who has a slipcover family business, a slipcover drapery business. I decided that also to make her ethnic, to make her Italian, And I'm Italian, so that came naturally. Also, I wanted her to come from a family, and the slipcover business I decided would be a family business. I wanted her to come from the type of family of craftspeople where reading or not reading was not that vital an issue, so that she would feel comfortable within the context of her family. I wanted her to be a very warm person, and so the Italian background there fit in for me because Italian families tend to have very warm relationships within that family. Heroines have to be warm, and that worked for me. I also wanted her to be very sensitive about her non-reading. I wanted this to be something that she kept secret from anyone but people who were very close to her. So that this is something she's defensive about, that she tries not to let other people know, that she feels very sort of scarred by the experience she had in school over this. Secretly thinks there's something terribly wrong with her. So as I went through all this, I also decided, how am I going to make her still, people who read books this is such an important thing to all of us, such a thing we take so much for granted. I had to make her have an inquiring mind. And in the opening chapter, I decided on a scene where she goes into the library and she takes out book tapes. And this is something she does all the time, so that she has really listened to tapes of books by Faulkner and even Shakespeare. And since she has such a good memory, she's memorized lines from these books, so that later on I have her quoting Shakespeare to the hero, and he's imagining for 2/3 of the book that she is, very well read indeed, because she can quote Shakespeare at him and she knows all the plots and she can discuss books with him. So, and I think also the scene where she's trying to fool the librarian to give her the tape, and I think that sort of makes you sympathetic with her and her problem. And I decided even to go a step further and to make her ambitious. She has her own business. She makes drapes and slipcovers. But she would like to expand the family business. She'd like to open a store, but she's very hesitant to do this because, not being able to read, she knows she can't handle the books. She can't write sales slips, and she's wondering if she can possibly do this. And later on, I have the hero help her out with it, not knowing her reading problem, but he does some of the negotiating for her. So anyway, I had made sort of these basic decisions about her, how to make her, and she really began very quickly to take shape in my mind as a person. And I no longer felt that she was alien to me. I really began to sort of get into her. But the thing that really made her real to me was picking a name. And I think it's very important for picking names for characters. Sometimes I think that unless you can get the right name, you can never really get into that character. But once you've got the exact right name, then you've got it made. So I decided that the right name for my character was going to be Francie, and that her name was Francesca, but people called her Francie. And somehow that just clicked for me. That was the right name. All right, so I was beginning at this point to have Francie. Now for the hero. Okay, I think when it comes to heroes, that romance readers, and this is certainly true of me, want to be able to fall in love with this hero. However, I had to have a hero for which reading, her non-reading, was going to be a problem. So again, that created a problem for me. How can I make a hero, who's not going to like that she can't read, and yet not have him seem like a snob? So I started thinking about my hero, and the first thing that I decided was that he had to be an academic sort of person. He couldn't be a college professor because, again, Harlequin has done market research, and they don't want college professors. So I decided to make him a lawyer. And he went to Harvard, and he graduated summa cum laude. He was editor of the Law Review. He's had a brilliant career. He's decided to make him the county prosecutor in Howard County, and he's setting the world on fire as a county prosecutor. I also decided that there should be a class problem. So he's a wealthy guy. He comes from an elegant sort of country estate. His family has been in community service for over 100 years. They're very proud of their heritage. They're the kind of family that send all their children to not to Harlequin, to Harvard. Send all their sons to Harvard, and all these sons marry girls from Radcliffe. And this is the kind of background he comes from. So he is devastatingly handsome. He's very successful and smart. He's rich. He's charming. He's the kind of guy that women chase. And he's going to be very intimidating to someone like Francie. So the next thing I started thinking about was, okay, what you have to, when you write a first chapter, you have to introduce the hero and the heroine in that chapter from romance, and you have to set up the attraction between them. What kind of attraction is this going to be? Well, for the conflict to work, it seemed to me that the attraction had to be stronger on his side than it is on hers, because she is going to be, of course she's going to be attracted to him, any woman would be, because he's wonderful. But she can't be the aggressor in this relationship, because she's going to be put off by him. He's just someone, she'll say to herself, this guy is not for me, this couldn't possibly work, this would be a dead-end relationship, I don't want to get involved with someone like this. So he had to be the aggressor in the relationship, and this is fine. I think women like to read about that anyway. So I gave him the name of Adam, which seemed sort of appropriate for him. And I had to have him just bowled over by her when he sees her, an instant, very strong attraction. And he had to be very aggressive about it. And so that even though he's the kind of man that other women pursue, he's going to be so strongly attracted to her that he's going to keep pursuing her despite her turn-downs. So I had at that point then the nature of how part of the conflict would work between them, and what the attraction would be between them. And it was beginning to take shape in my mind how this would go. Okay, so this is going to be a Harlequin super romance. This is a fairly long book, and it needs a subplot. And it needs minor characters. It needs stronger minor characters than a shorter novel would require. So I started thinking about subplot. I think a good subplot reinforces or underlines or mirrors or somehow adds to the main relationship. So for this, I went back to Francie and her family. I pictured Francie living with her mother, who is a sort of typical Italian mother, cooks spaghetti a lot, and is very interested in her private life and very motherly kind of person. And I pictured her living in Little Italy in Baltimore in a row house with this mother and with her older sister, who's had a failed marriage and who has 4 kids. And her name was Teresa. And I decided to have Teresa have a love affair also. And I thought it would be interesting, and also it would help me write about Francie, if Teresa's love affair was quite different from Francie's. And in other words, one of the things about Adam that Francie doesn't like is that he comes from a different world. She doesn't feel she can talk to him about not being able to read. Teresa, on the other hand, meets the local owner of the Italian grocery, Mr. Venturo, and he does come from her world, and he is very understanding. He's known her since she was a child, and he knows exactly, she's very comfortable with him. And how this helped me was the 2 sisters can talk about the 2 relationships, so that Francie can tell her sister why she's worried about this guy Adam, and Teresa can talk about her developing feelings for the owner of the grocery store. And from the point of view of exposition, this really worked well for me, because I was able to get out a lot of things, a lot of feelings that the 2 women have by them sharing this experience. Okay, so I got that much set up in my mind. So then I started thinking about my hero again. What kind of subplot could he have? Well, I decided to give him a friend, too, someone who works with him in the county prosecutor's office, someone who's known him since childhood, that he could talk to, that he could perhaps share a little bit his feelings about Francie, that he could talk to about their work problems, so you have a sense of what kind of life Adam leads. I decided also, for the sake of the conflict, to make it more believable that Francie would wind up rejecting him, at least for a while, to give him an overbearing mother. This is a woman who's very family proud, who's very ambitious for her son. Adam is being courted by the state political machine to run for a national office, to run for congressman, and she really wants him to do this. She's very pushy about this. She also wants him to marry the right kind of girl, and Adam has had a girlfriend that he was relatively serious about until he got a look at Francie, and this girl was the right kind of girl. Graduated from Vassar and has all the proper qualifications, is socially very adept, is very sleek and well dressed, and can certainly read. Okay, so these elements then began to come together in my mind for Adam. And the conflict began to make sense to me as I thought about this. And I decided to add something else, because when you have a conflict, you have to resolve it. But sometimes you get yourself such a good conflict, you get to the end of the book and you think, how are they going to work this out? So anyway, you have to resolve this conflict. Well, it seemed to me that two things had to happen. If it's a good, strong conflict, they can't just decide, well, it's okay. You know, Francie had, at some point, to learn how to read. And so that was going to be part of the development of the story, her efforts, the struggle she goes through to learn how to read. And the other part of the conflict would be, I decided to put Adam under some kind of threat. So throughout the book, he's being harassed by a mystery person, and it's not clear who it is, but since he's prosecuted a lot of criminal types, it's someone that he's prosecuted. And at the end, this person hurts him, and this helped resolve the conflict because it helped show Francie how much she really did love him. So, and that sort of added, it's a minor element in the plot, but it does sort of help things gel toward the end. And also how he deals with these threats, I think helped Adam seem like a real person. So anyway, at this point I had my heroine, my conflict, my heroine, my hero, my subplot, and my minor characters and my tone. Point of view, well, in romance it's going to be either strictly from the heroine's point of view, or it's going to be both the hero and the heroine's point of view. And mostly I do with both points of view. And I think that really makes it easier to get a handle on what kind of people both of these are, to write from both points of view. So I knew I was going to do it that way. So when I had this much together, I was able to write 2 chapters and an outline. And I got a contract on the book. So from then, I had to actually write the book. And as you start writing it, you get to know your characters much better, and new things develop. I found, as I was writing, for example, it was interesting that I really got into Francie right away. I had a very strong feeling for her. I had no trouble writing about her. She just seemed to come very naturally, which surprised me because I hadn't thought she would, but she did. Adam was more of a difficulty. And what I realized, I heard Kathy Seidel, when she talked, say that she was having a problem with her hero, that he was, I think, a fine shadow of a man or something like that.
Yes, it's one of the favorite expressions.
Yeah, well, I realized that Adam was still a fine shadow of a man, that he was, okay, he's handsome, he's rich, he's successful, he's smart, he's charming, he's everything you would want, but on the other hand, he's just really a caricature. He's just another pretty face. What is it about him that makes this man really interesting? What is it about him that's going to make Francie really fall in love with him despite her reservations? So I had to stop at that point. I was sort of well into the book when I made this realization. So I had to stop at this point and start to think about Adam. And what is it like to really be born with everything, to have everything, to have all the gifts? What kind of person would you be if you were that fortunate? And I picked up a book on rich people and read it. And it was a revelation to me. It was very interesting. All the psychological hang-ups that rich people have, a lot of them feel very guilty. This sense of inner guilt about being given all these gifts, whereas other people have to struggle for them. And they work this out in various ways, as some of them become wastrels and commit suicide, but others have a strong sense of noblesse oblige, a strong sense of obligation toward others. And I decided that Adam had to be that kind of person. Why is he so driven? Why is he graduating from Harvard summa cum laude when he's handsome and rich and doesn't need to? Why is he killing himself doing a dangerous job as a county prosecutor? Why is he such a whirlwind at this job? Why does he want to take on a political career when he doesn't need to, when he really is not power hungry? What is it about him that makes him want to do this thing? And so I decided that he had to be a kind of person who has a strong sense of sort of guilt about being so darn lucky, a strong sense of obligation toward others, a kind of a knight-errant complex. And it helped me that he has a friend who knew him since he was a little boy, because I was able to have that friend talk to Francie about what kind of a little boy Adam was. And I dreamed up a story for his friend to tell Francie about finding an injured dog on the road that someone had left to die. And I think pets are good, because if you see someone being nice to an animal, you like them. And my problem, I do anyway. And my problem with Adam is how do I really like him when he's so, he's got everything, he's so perfect. How can you really like Mr. Perfect? All right, so when he was a little boy, the two of these boys found this animal dying on the road. It had been hit by a car and left to die, and the animal does die. But Adam decides to find out who did it. He sets up a little private investigation. He finds out who did it. It was this wealthy man who drives around in a bottle green Jaguar, that everyone knows. And he finds the evidence, the blood on the bumper and the whole thing. And since he's a child, he's only 10 years old, and he can't really get vengeance publicly, he puts sugar in the guy's gas tank. And he then tells his mother. He can't be sneaky about it. He then marches up to his mother and tells her what he's done. Right. It's the same principle. His mother is furious because it's a friend of hers, and makes him pay for the Jaguar. So he spends the next 10 years giving all his allowance, paying for. But so he was the only rich kid in high school who never had any money. Well, I really liked this story, and apparently it worked for my editor when she saw it, because that made Adam to her a very appealing person, and it also made understandable his really strong ambition, his drive, and I cooked up a couple other things like this to make. He talks to Francie at one point about a letter his father wrote him about what's important in life, and service to others is part of what's important in life, using your gifts to help others, and this kind of thing. So Adam began to shape up then as a likable person. And once I was sort of on this track, I decided to take it a step further. And I stuck this in later as I was thinking about Adam. He has to, her not being able to read has to be somewhat of a problem for him when he finds out about it. I have him, there's a mentally retarded guy who was accused of a crime, and Adam realized he was innocent and defended him and got him off the hook. But this guy, who's very likable but not very bright, keeps getting into trouble. People tease him, take him out to roadhouses and get him to buy them dinner and then leave him with the bill, and he doesn't know, stuff like this. So I have him, he calls Adam up at regular intervals in the middle of the night and asks for help, and Adam goes out and helps him. And Adam is fond of him, but he's mentally, and one of the reasons this guy gets into so much trouble like this is that he can't read. He doesn't know what's happening. All right, so this was really beginning to gel for me. So the first 2/3 of the book are Francie resisting Adam's blandishments, but nevertheless being more and more attracted to him. I gave Francie a nephew. Her nephew, whom she's very fond of, has inherited the dyslexia. And in trying to help him, you learn about the problems of a dyslexic. You also see that Francie is a very warm and caring person. And she also begins to address her own problem in helping her nephew. She begins to find a way for her to address her reading problem. Okay, so that's really the first two-thirds of the book where all these things are being worked out. And then I had to have, because I think at this point, all of the stuff has to come to a head. There had to be a big dramatic scene. After we've had Francie struggling through menus and restaurants and going into the wrong bathroom, and a scene where Adam is cooking and he asks her to get him some paprika, and she can't read the spices on the counter, and she sees a red thing and she hands it to him, and it's red pepper. Little things like that where she is constantly making mistakes, and so she is very aware, that she's very aware of her problem. The reader continues to be aware of her problem. It has to all come to a head, and Adam has to find out that this girl can't read. He's thinking, oh, she's such an intellectual. She can quote Shakespeare. Why is she resisting me this way? And I cooked up a real big dramatic scene where it comes out that she can't read in a very embarrassing and humiliating way in front of his mother. Something that's and all his classy friends. So that she is going to back off from the relationship, and it's a bad enough thing that happens that I think it makes it understandable to you why she would, even though she's in love with him and even though he's so wonderful. Okay, so having gotten this far, then the conflict had to be resolved. They have several confrontations in which she tells him. First of all, she tells him she can't read. He has a little trouble dealing with this, but finally he does deal with it. But she can't. She feels there's a scene where he proposes to her and talks about, as he proposes, he talks about how he has to start saving money so all their kids can go to Harvard. And she knows, of course, that it's very likely, or at least possible, that their children will be in remedial reading classes. They won't be going to Harvard. So she refuses his proposal, and she gives him a cooked-up reason for it. However, at this point I had to resolve the conflict, and so I do have her learning how to read, and I do have her realizing how much she cares for him and sort of throwing caution to the winds and deciding that she can be a political wife, and she's going to try. And she does, and there's an epilogue showing that, in fact, the two of them go very well together because he seems perhaps a little cool to the voters, but she's such a warm person and comes from an ethnic neighborhood, and that she compliments him very well, and that they make a good, compatible couple. Okay, so this book, which started out with that idea, I developed the conflict from character, and it came to life for me as I added the elements that I think are important in a novel, the subplot, the minor characters. As I began to think about the main characters and what kind of people they are, the whole thing, all these little hooked atoms really began to come together and form a whole for me. And I guess the point of this is that it used to be when I first started writing, I would think, well, I'll wait for an idea to sort of float around in my head and take shape, and one of these days it'll take shape and I'll be able to write the story. Well, if you're Lucretius and you're making the world and you have eons, maybe eventually this will happen, and sometimes it does happen. But I think when you're writing a book, what I find now that I have to do is sort of put those atoms in a kind of cyclotron and force them into various patterns and configurations until I get some that begin to work for me. So it's the same process, but it's that I go through, but it's much harder work. I'm not just sort of lolling around, letting bits and pieces come together at random and waiting for one of them to look good to me. I'm taking the bits and pieces and I'm moving them around in different patterns until finally one begins to make sense. And sometimes I get 2 or 3 different patterns that seem to work, and I then pick the one that seems to make the most sense to me, seems to be the most workable within the framework that I know is wanted for a romance novel. So anyway, starting off with the inspiration to the realization, that's sort of the way, that's the way this particular book came together. It's sometimes less direct than that. It is often less direct than that with other books, but it just happened that this one really followed what seemed to me to be a fairly logical pattern.